This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true crime junkies and all of you truth seekers out there. Welcome back for a new year. I hope everybody had a wonderful holiday. We're going to look at episode 3 today and talk about the second half of the handwriting between Jack Tarrance and the Zodiac Killer. We left off at the capital letter M, and today we're going to start with the lowercase m, hopefully make it through the balance of this presentation that makes the identification, and then hopefully by next week we will actually be starting on Jack's path. This morning we're going to start with, like I said, the lowercase m, so we're going to begin that presentation at this point. Jack's lowercase m is one that is extremely unique. If there is any other letter in his arsenal, the letter m is the one that he would want to have hidden. And that is because his lowercase m is pretty much like his capital case M, and he actually writes it in a capital version versus a lowercase m in the middle of lowercase writing when he prints. So what we typically tend to see is this broken in the middle, either 2-part or 3 and 4 strokes to make this letter M. I believe that he definitely attempted to conceal this, though we did see it intermittently dropped, and we'll talk about those as we find them. So we do have regular version M's from Jack in his lower cases, and I did put those up just so that we can do a side-by-side comparison to the Zodiac and what we would expect to see. So on this K28, which is Jack's, we see this angular hump that comes off with a slight curvature. That is definitely something that we see occurring in the Zodiac's writing. We also see that he starts here at the top, works his way down, and then back up and into that M, which is again something that we see the Zodiac doing there. We also see this shallow, almost like the capital M's that we looked at the last time, where he doesn't really quite bring the middle section of that letter M down into the baseline. And we can see again, that is something that we found inside of the Zodiac's writing. The regular letter M that we see is also extremely consistent in the formation of the humps, the shallowness of the midsection, and of course that double stroke that happens where he starts from the top, works his way down, and then up and finally into the letter. Both authors obviously use the same version, letter M, but I did find one that stood out in Jack's handwriting, which is this K50 over here. And it's what I refer to as the 3 hump N. And he's actually writing this in printing. So we're going to see this later in the lipstick killings in 1945. We see the 3-stroke or 3 hump M that is going to be used, which that will be one of the earliest crimes that we visit. So from here, we'll go on to the capital letter N. And again, if you weren't with us last time, the K's are the known, which means that's Jack. The Q's are the question, which means they are the Zodiac. So basically, when I pulled up all of the N's that I could find in Jack's arsenal and compared them to the N's in the Zodiac's arsenal, of course, what I felt to be the more natural letter N's, we can actually see that the shape of some of these letters are consistent, including this curved middle bar or stem from Jack to the Zodiac. We see that curvature that occurs. We also have that double stroke again that we talked about in the letter M as it comes down and goes back up. Even the angles of the actual strokes of this letter M are consistent between each other, including to have a curvature on the right-hand side, which we also see in the Zodiac's handwriting. So there's many consistencies between these two authors, including K12 and Q3, in the way that the left side is formed. Now, I want everybody to understand that, again, we never write the same way twice. So when I'm doing an examination, what I'm looking to see is that the puzzle pieces fit, so that if he forms the curvature in the center on the outside of the stroke of the N, that is something that is consistently being done in other versions, because we don't necessarily expect to see an identical letter N. However, when we do find that, that is pretty much a home run. Again, we also have these types of N's that came from Jack. We still see that double stroke that's happening, which is that indication of the thicker stroke here, that he actually starts from the top, works his way down before he comes back in. I know that Q63 is a little complicated to see, but what we see is that curvature with the rounded top on the left-hand side, which we're seeing here, including that curved bar that comes out from the top and raises higher than the rest of the letter N. So again, we have some consistencies there. In the lowercase n, Jack also formed it with 4 strokes, quite like his letter M, only when he does this and he writes it with speed, it ends up looking like a W. So this was another one of the key characteristics that I was looking for in the Zodiac writing, but again, probably a character that Jack would want to omit from his writing, especially if he did not want an identification to be made. So I did pull some regular letter N's from Jack as well over here in the K98. One of the things that I noticed in the haste of writing the Zodiac letters, especially when those letters appeared to be manic, we got this W type letter N, that is being executed. And you can see all of these down here that clearly have 4 strokes. This is exactly what I would expect to find left behind from somebody who was hoping to disguise this. What we did get from the Zodiac, aside from these intermittent droppings of what I call the WN for Jack, is the regular N's. And even then, we can see that the shape and the consistencies of these letters are very, very similar with what Jack has in his arsenal when he writes his letter N normally. The letter O is actually an interesting character for Jack, because he tends to write a cursive letter O with a loop inside of it. And that's not something most people do when they print. So as I started to find these cursive written letter O's from the Zodiac, I was able to also find those cursive written O's by Jack. And that is indicated by this inner loop. Let's see if I have... Okay, so basically also the shape itself of the letter O's, this egg shape that tends to lean to the right-hand side, was definitely something we saw Jack doing. So these are all the capital letter O's here at the top, and then we'll move on to the lowercase O's, where we can see the consistency, or what I'm talking about in regards to those inner loops that occur. And this is all done in the middle of printed writing. So I wasn't shocked to find that many of the letter O's in the Zodiac case also contained these inner loops, and the shape and the size and the slant of these letters are also consistent with one another. The letter P, again, we have Jack at the top, Zodiac at the bottom. We can see that he can make it in this 2-stroke, or he typically makes all of his P's in 2-stroke connection, so not a single stroke. And we can see that that's exactly what the Zodiac did. Also, we see the shape of the bowl, the way the incline of the lower portion of it comes up, and even almost to a pointed tip, which is definitely what Jack has going on in his particular letter P's. We also see this break that occurs on the back side of the P, which is consistent with some of the ones found in the Zodiac writing. The lowercase p's were also absolutely identical, folks. If we can look at these ones here, we can see this angularity that I was talking about, where the bowl actually inclines up to a point, and that is definitely consistent with what we see happening. In fact, this particular letter P even has a wraparound where the bowl itself actually crosses back over to the left beyond the stem. We see that occurring right here with the zodiac. This was one of my favorite, because when we talk about landing or finding a perfect letter P, or one that is almost identical to another one that's written, we can see here that even the curvature in the backside of the stem up here with the P is consistent. The overhang that comes back beyond the actual stem itself to the left, a slight break between the stem and the bowl itself is seen in both authors. And we even have pretty much the same exact slant to the stem that actually kicks back to the left on the bottom. Here we have another P, again with the shape, that angularity, that angularity. Here is what I would call Jack's his home run letter. Everybody's got one. We all have something that we do different from somebody else. The letter Q was actually a huge home run for Jack, and that's because he creates the letter Q almost like the number 8 with 2 circles, and we can see that that is identical to what the zodiac was doing. And even those shapes that you find for the loop on the bottom are consistent in shape, reducing themselves down to this angular portion here, and we see that that's occurring. This one, K71, compared to the Q43 and Q32, again looks like a number 8, only this one looks like your figure 8. So it appears as though he wrote it in a figure 8 fashion, though I'm not clear that that's exactly how that worked out, or the direction of these strokes, since these are all copies and they're pretty much, they're not the greatest quality, but they are quality enough to be able to determine actually the shape and the size and the relation of the top to the bottom. Then we had one final letter Q, which was basically just had a curvature coming back on the bottom left, on the bottom side, that crossed back over to the left. We can see again that that is definitely another way that Jack actually executes it. We have an opening back here at the top of the bowl of the P, which is consistent as well with the zodiac. Capital letter R's, we have, again, across the top, the different variations that Jack actually uses. The first letter R that I like to talk about is what I refer to as the swing back. So he basically swings back with a curvature that comes out from the bottom of the leg of the R. And we see these 3 different styles of R's, which are definitely consistent with what the zodiac is doing. So he swings back and he uses a curvature rather than coming back and then arching outward. But we do see some of those over here, which we'll talk about. Again, here's another one of those R's where the leg of the R is coming off of the bottom, very close to the bottom, not nearly at the midpoint like you would expect. And we can see that that is occurring as well over here in Jack's. Almost even gives you the same kind of look as far as the stance of the R itself. In these particular R's over here, we pulled these Q62 and Q63 from the Sherry Joe Bates letters. Again, we can see the similarities in the form and the shape and the relation of the bowl to the actual legs and stems of the R's. With the final letter R's over here to the right, again, we also have that swing back where it's just kind of a curvature as it works its way out, but that is definitely consistent with the zodiac's writing. Another letter that they looked heavily for in the zodiac's writing, or they were looking for obviously in the suspect's handwriting, was what they refer to as the check mark R. So here we see some R's that have this little tiny hook that comes off of the right hand side of it. We can see that that's happening right here in Jack's handwriting. And then we also find down here in the bottom, this is what they referred to as the check mark R in the zodiac's handwriting. So clearly we can see that Jack also uses this very same version of the check mark R. The letter S was extremely consistent, although S's aren't a high hitter for me because a lot of people tend to have some similar characteristics, whether it be the flattened top at the entrance of the S or the angular portion at the bottom. But we do see that when we look at some of these, they almost look like number twos, and that's what we're having, but that's what we're finding inside of the Zodiac writing with that angular bottom and the overhang or the top that actually extends to the right further than the rest of the letter. So as I went through, I did not find any inconsistencies, let's say. So the similarities are still standing at this point, especially with shape and size and formation. All seem to be fitting between the two authors. In the letter T's, we have the capital letter T, which we see these long strokes that actually come up to the stem of the letter H in most cases. The curvature of the actual T itself, we can find those occurring in Jack's writing. But this TH connection was something that I wanted to make sure that everybody saw, where the T actually connects right on into the letter H. And we saw that was happening definitely with the Zodiac stuff. The lowercase t's were also consistent in their affect. He tends to singularly cross each of his t's. I have two t's in my name. I tend to cross both of them at the same time, so it was fitting to find double t's to be able to show that both authors, in fact, cross each t singularly. And some of the t's actually end up looking just like plus signs by virtue of where he places the crossbar. We can see, again, consistencies between those. Another thing that we talk about with the Zodiac and with Jack is that he has this hook at the bottom of his T, which is the extension or this small spot at the bottom of K8, which we can see occurring in Q19 as well. So we will be seeing what I refer to as copybook T's, which actually have the curvature at the bottom, making them look like a backwards J that's been crossed. In the letter U's, we find that Jack uses both versions, one with an actual stem on the right-hand side, and then a version that does not contain a stem, looks just like a horseshoe. And we can see that the Zodiac, in fact, used both versions, used both the stem and he used it without the stem. The consistency between these are obviously the shape, the way this side is lower and a little more curved towards the center. We see that's happening over here as well. And then even this one with this kind of wavy effect that's happening as he comes up off the top of the U. The letter V's that are found below, I don't think that we need to spend a whole heck of a lot of time on them, since it's just two or it's a single stroke, but it's just two left and right strokes that you can see are actually identical in the way they lean, in the way the right side is higher or longer than the left side. And then, of course, those different shapes that occur. So we have some that are rounded at the bottom. We have some that are angular at the bottom. And they are all literally consistent with each other. So when you lay down slant bars, you find that the slant of the right side is consistent with each other. In the letter W, we have a couple different kinds that Jack does. We have the rounded version. We also have the angular version. And we got to see just, this was a URL that he had written. And mind you, he was very, very computer literate for the time, and especially at his age. So we see this W is found in the Zodiac's handwriting as well, with the angular bottoms. We also find the rounded versions as well, and we can see that they literally lean and are consistent with each other. Again, with this curvature that happens on the right-hand side, we see happening in Jack's handwriting as well. The letter X, again, one of those ones that you don't have a whole lot to talk about, but there isn't any differences. We don't see anything major or drastic that would cause me to say that this is not within the realm of the author or of Jack. So moving into the letter Y, I always found it interesting. Jack always has this little tiny arm to the left here of the Y and a super long stroke that continues down into the lower zone. We can see that that's exactly, again, what the Zodiac is doing. We have a very short arm. We have the very long stem that comes down. And even the slant, you can idealize here that if a bar was placed down, that those slants of the direction of that stem is going to be consistent with each other. As we move over, we also see a slight curvature in the backside of the stem, which was over here in the K112 as well. But we did see some longer curved stems by the Zodiac. And again, this arm that does not connect or touch. So it's basically, it almost looks like if it was pulled separately and blown up, you would not know this was a letter Y, because this looks like some arbitrary marking that is not connected to the stem. And again, we see that in the Zodiac's handwriting. The letter Z's are also extremely consistent with each other in the shape, the lean. It always kind of reminded me of a snake that was winding back to strike. That is definitely consistent with the way the Zodiac executed his letter Z's. And over here, we can see more of the consistencies with the hard angular at the top and a rounded, slightly angular exit on the bottom of the bottom bar. I think that is it for that. Let's move into some of the punctuation that I found. So between Jack and the Zodiac, when they do the and sign, again, consistent. Not a huge home run hit, simply because we only have a couple ways to do and signs, and many people actually use the star-shaped form. The differences here is over here in the K119, where we see that the connection becomes arched or curved as he comes back to do the cross. And we can actually see that's what's occurring right here in the Zodiac's writing as well. I also noted the use of heavy period dots and circular eye dots or circular period dots. This is consistent between both authors. Once again, not many people use heavy period dotting. It's usually some sign of anger, aggression. So I wasn't surprised to see this in what I know from Jack's handwriting and about Jack, as well as knowing what we know about the Zodiac, who is clearly very aggressive, mean, and upset. The commas that I found inside both authors are definitely extremely consistent, with the straight line comma to the slightly curved. They also tend to exaggerate these commas, so they tend to be a little bit longer than necessary, and we'll see those when we actually look at the envelopes up close and how he positioned those commas. Moving on to another consistency, which we will talk about, the diagrams that the Zodiac used, and that is because Jack was an engineer and he wrote lots of diagrams, and many of them very, very consistent with what I found in the Zodiac's handwriting. And one of those is always the power source. The power source always seems to be the sun. And in the Zodiac's diagrams itself, again, we find the power source is a sun. He does talk about a battery, which we'll see both of them actually use the same construction for condensing that word to BAT. And then we have the question marks. So basically, I'm looking at the slant of the question mark and how the dot itself is more to the left, and the actual top of the the question mark is floating backwards towards the right, almost as if it's leaning to the right. This is consistent between, once again, both authors. We also see the almost lack of the end of the tail of the question mark itself, which we can see over here as well. And then all the way to this hard, sharp, angular portion where it just comes straight down with the period dot beneath it. It, again, is something we can see inside of the Zodiac's writing. Now we're going to get into some spacing, because spacing is also one of those things that are interpersonal. Typically speaking, the average writer has between a 1 to 3 millimeter movement within their writing at any given time. So we're looking to make sure that it is actually within that 1 to 3 millimeters in order to identify the spacing elements. So I've lined up some words that I found. I found several times that Jack had written the word signed, and we know that the Zodiac liked to write the word signed as well. So I laid down these bars to show where the beginning of everything is, and I plotted this one off of the backside of the top end of the S, and then I literally just laid down one at any given point before or after the letter to see how they lined up. We see that the backsides of the G's, when I chose to plot the backside of the G, we end up on the backside of the G all the way through. The letter N, I put that one right straight down the middle. We again find that it hits right straight down the middle. The letter E, now we can kind of see that 1 to 3 millimeter difference where it might be a little more to the left or a little more to the right, depending on what they were up to that day and how they were writing. Needless to say, we still find them that are lining up between the two. Now, the letter D on this one is kind of estranged because we don't even see the bowl. I think this is probably one of his more quickly written letters, maybe even a little manic. Could have been done directly after one of the murders. But we see that either way, as I laid this down through Jack's, how it lined up. And had there been a bowl here, we would have found the bowl to the left and the stem to the right. And the word off, I did the same thing. I plotted the bar down the right side of the O just to show the spacing between the O and the F. And we can clearly see how this second bar that's on the F's does not quite touch the stem itself. There's a small gap between that bar and the crossing section of the F, and that's similar as well up here to Jack's. And then with the final bar laying completely down, literally laid on the backside of the stem of the letter F. Finding identical words always is a challenge, because that's what you're looking for when you're doing spacing, is that we have the same apple to apple comparison. Here I chose one was express because it's where I could get the largest word, press, and then expressed. And then, of course, the Zodiac as well wrote the word express. So we get to see how those line up on top of each other, the E straight down. Of course, this bar did not touch either of these X's. The third bar came right down the backside of the bowl of the P. And then, of course, this one was slightly off a little bit, but as we pick up with the letter E, we start to find that we're back into a consistency where just the tip of the E is sticking out over on the right-hand side. And then, of course, the way it actually lines up with the S's again as the final spacing element. So it is a little more coincidental to have the smaller words actually line up because it's only 3 letters. However, I find when you get into larger words with more letters, to find that those line up seems to be more of an alignment with the author itself as far as spacing is concerned. Here's a couple more words that we did. Slight differences aren't necessarily a concern. Like I said, that 1 to 3 millimeter difference, as long as the majority is where it should be, that's what we're looking for. So I picked the word develop and developer from the Zodiac, and we can see where these actually line up. Since we were dealing with a capital D versus a lowercase d, I went ahead and started my markings at the E to show that the relation to each bar there afterwards actually brings us up to about the same point with each one, including the letter L, where the bar actually touches the bottom of the L because it's slanted to the right, and instead of being straight up and down and perpendicular where the entire L would probably have lined up on this particular bar, we see that both authors have this tendency to slant to the right, which means that is coming over and touching the next bar right at the O. which again, we have a very similar spacing between those. And then when I plotted down the P, even though this O was not as large as this O, we can still see this gap between the O and the P right here between both authors. And then when I lay the next bar down, of course, it picks right up on the letter P and continues to even out in spacing all the way down to a slight portion of the letter E to the left-hand side of this bar in both authors' handwriting. I was able to find the word properly. And again, we find that the lineup or the spacing, if we had a stem on this letter R, it's missing. If we had that stem, we would probably find that that stem was a little bit more to the left, because we can already see that the overhang of that letter R is touching the bar and slightly protrudes to the left just a tiny bit, just as this one does up here. Again, we have these L's that are slanted to the right, and we have these letter Y's that we were talking about earlier with the almost missing left arm. Again, just a consistency between the actual spacing itself, which is just another indication that we're dealing with the same author. So with that being said, I'm going to render, or at least release, my opinion at this point in time that I do find that the handwriting that I have looked at is in all aspects in agreement and consistent with that of Jack Tarrance, which is why I made the identification and began completing this particular presentation based on other crime sprees that contained letters that the handwriting could also be analyzed in. Just a note, some of the letters that are in this presentation that have come to me through anonymous sources. They've reached out, they've friended me and acted as though they were interested in assisting or helping with something. They eventually would drop a letter off on me and then disappear into the oblivion. So we'll talk about those letters as they come up, ones that were given to me. Dennis Kaufman was only concerned with the Zodiac case. In fact, he was quite shocked when I started putting other cases together with this. But I want everybody to know that I'm not the first document examiner to do this. I do know of document examiners who have already established that they believe the handwriting from the Lipstick Killer and the Black Dahlia was also consistent with the Sherry Jo Bates and the Zodiac murders. So it's not a strange field for me to be going in there. Recently, I'm hearing other inclusions of murders from down south, like in Gaviota, San Diego. Some of these places or some of these murders are well before what we know to be the Zodiac's time, but I'm actually going to cover murders from 1944 all the way to 2001. Possibly 2004. There is a question in regards to one in 2004, but we'll take each one a piece at a time. And basically, I'm just really looking at these due to Jack's proximity and where he is. Chris Hopkins with the FBI had indicated to me at one point in time that the idea here is to solidify or to close the case of the Zodiac on Jack Tarrance. Once that occurs, then we can look at other serial killing sprees as a possibility, since once he's been named as a killer once, it's completely plausible that this isn't this first or last time that Jack has committed these types of crimes. All right, so this is just the beginning here, but I just wanted to give you some information. The links below take you to the Zodiac exemplars used in the 2011 examination that I prepared for Napa Sheriff's Department. Shout out. Just finished a forensic latent print class with them. Very interesting class. Again, something I got into because I do actually have a fingerprint, a full rolled right fingerprint from Jack that contains 2 deltas. A delta never repeats itself on any individual. Let alone has it been found to repeat itself in another individual. So I feel like we do have a good print, and everybody needs to take this seriously, step up to the plate, do the examinations, see if we can actually close this case and many others. The next link actually takes to the known handwriting of Jack Tarrance that I used, and it's labeled by the numbers that you saw in the actual presentation that I was giving. That way you can relate back to the letter or the communication where I pulled the actual letters or the cutouts that we just viewed. So each one is trackable back to a particular communication, and that's what those K's and Q numbers identify. So my story begins, well, that should have said 2000. Dennis Kaufman and his brother-in-law was watching an episode of America's Most Wanted, featuring Tom Voight. I'm not sure, but I believe Bart Baggett, my mentor, was also on this particular episode. While they were watching it, Dennis mentioned that he believed that the composite, he told his brother-in-law that the composite looked like Jack. The description that they were giving, the mentality, the persona of the individual was like Jack. And that's where this case really actually began. So John Walsh is telling the story of the Zodiac murders. Of course, he does at one point in time also receive letters from the suspect, or let's just call him Jack now at this point. I think we're clear on the handwriting for it. They're called the Scorpion letters that John Walsh received in 1990 or 91. Again, something we will visit. I do find that the handwriting on those documents are consistent with the Zodiac murders, and that the suspect is attempting to once again get his story told versus what John Walsh is portraying on TV. We know that's notoriously Zodiac 101. He wants credit for what he knows he's done, and he doesn't want to take credit for anything he had nothing to do with. So we do have some cassettes. I'm going to look them up, recordings, I believe, that are recorded live of what we're about to talk about here. But these are some of the questions that were asked of Jack Tarrance while Dennis was recording those phone calls to kind of get a feel for where he was at in regards to this case, because Dennis truly believed he was the Zodiac. So Dennis begins by saying, "Hello, Jack, what is going on?" And Jack said, "Just sitting here thinking about how the hell I could get to the Bitterroot Mountains." Jack was an orienteer. He loved to be in the mountains. He loved to send the children out on excursions when they first got to camp, send them out as far as he could, and expects them to make it back to camp on their own. Dennis said, "I know the feeling of not having a vehicle." He says, "Well, I was calling you because I wanted to talk to you about something, but I wanted to let you know that it would stay just between you and I." And Jack responded, "Well, here I am." Dennis, "Well, I think I have discovered something very interesting, and I think you know what I'm talking about, don't you?" Jack's response is, "Yeah, I do." Dennis says, "Jack, I will say this much. You have become the most interesting person I've ever met. I won't hold any of it against you. I'm probably the only one that understands." Jack asked, "What are you going to do? Write a book?" And Dennis said, "That's exactly what I was thinking about doing." Jack says, "I haven't cut anybody's throat lately. I got tired of doing it." That's a very odd response for somebody who hasn't even been hit up about being the Zodiac Killer yet, since, to my knowledge, and as we go back through, cutting someone's throat was not one of the MOs for the Zodiac, but we do see it in some other cases, which, again, we're going to cover. Dennis responds, "I can understand. Like I told you, if there's anybody that understands, it's me. Everybody does things for their own reasons, and no one can say they are bad or pass judgment until they walk in their shoes." Jack responded, "That's true, but you try and cover things up, and then some smartass comes along and wants to write I'm going to censor this, flocking book about you, and then you're in trouble again." So clearly Jack is concerned about this book being written where it may actually point fingers at him and he can end up in trouble for something he has long since evaded. So Dennis continues to say, "That's why I was calling you. I wasn't just going to put a book out about you without talking to you about it." Jack responded, "I don't want my name in it anywhere." Dennis says, "Well, I can change your name. It isn't no big deal. Let me just ask you straight out. Are you the fucking Zodiac, or am I just imagining things?" Jack's response was, "Well, let me see. What time is it?" Again, a very interesting response. Typically speaking, I find that people who answer a question with a question are attempting to search for an alternate truth. So they're looking to lie, they're looking for something to come up with to say, and that question buys them time to think. Dennis continued, well, you don't have anything to worry about because there have been 2,500 suspects, and if someone tried to say they knew who the Zodiac was, they would lock them up in the nut house. So it don't matter what is said because no one would fucking believe you anyways. If I wrote a book and said, I think my father is the Zodiac, no one would believe it. Jack responded, why would you put that I think in there? This is such a high profile case. It was on television the other night, and it was the #1 unsolved crime in history. Jack responded again, do you still have a car? If you do, take a run out. Jack was asking for Dennis to actually come see him. Dennis said, I think I will do that. I would like to come out and talk with you. So a few weeks later, a second conversation actually occurred. Jack states, most of the things I'm recalling, they are really not interested in prosecution. They just as soon it don't even come up. That's where the interesting part comes in, because everything about the Zodiac is clearly known by everybody. So Jack is alluding to something other than the Zodiac that has occurred, and it has to do with it maintaining its silence, just as the finale letter actually indicated, was how he had come forward, but his identity is still unknown. This is boggling Jack, but he does understand at the same time that they just don't have the evidence anymore in these cases to actually make an arrest and see justice be handled. He said, Jack says, the things I'm talking about, they would rather it just stayed out of their sight because most of it is years ago. Dennis responds, I guess it made them look so bad they would rather just forget about it. I would, however, like to have something that I could prove whom you were after you are gone. Jack responds, after it is written in is fiction, and then after I'm gone, you can make it nonfiction. Again, a very explicit request by a suspect that we know consistently wanted his story told, consistently wanted the world to know what he had going. So Dennis said, I guess I made them look so bad that they would rather just forget about it. I would, however, like to have something that I could prove whom you were after you are gone. Oh, reread. Sorry, guys. Dennis continues to state, you could tell me how the codes work. That would be interesting. Jack says, we will discuss that. Some of the mean stuff happened before I went into the Navy in 1946. And if we're going to talk about mean stuff, we're literally looking at bisection, something that Jack was very familiar with doing with small and large game as a hunter and growing up on the ranch. And also where we're seeing that necks have been cut. So even though we don't see that in the Zodiac stuff, some of the things that he's talking about at this point in time actually allude to other crimes that have nothing to do with the Zodiac case. So these conversations are what we set the very next steps in motion and how we're going to go through this presentation. Dennis Kaufman was determined to do whatever he had to do to show and support the evidence that proved his father, Jack W. Tarrance Jr., is in fact the Zodiac Killer, including requesting the services of myself to examine the handwriting to determine if Jack was the author of the Zodiac letters. Basically, when I got involved with this, I was given, as I stated before, I was given approximately 5 samples of Jack's handwriting, and I had no way of knowing what was a good communication from the Zodiac. So I reached out to my mentor, who provided me with the Bell-Eye letter. Again, one of the most disguised letters. If I see another person attempt to make a sole identification in comparison to that letter, I'll just scream. Just know they're not doing this industry or the science of handwriting any justice by attempting to use almost a completely disguised handwriting in order to make claims that others write like it. Because we can see and we can tell that clearly that is written with an attempt to copybook form, which no person writes like normally. So after viewing that particular letter, that is where I actually found that the letter O's with the cursive loops inside of them. I think I found I was up until about 4 a.m. and I found approximately 20 characteristics that were consistent between the two authors. And I began looking for more letters, more communications from the Zodiac that I could make that comparison with. I did find lots of them on Tom Voigt's website, throughout the internet. And again, some were just brought to me and dropped into my lap. I would have never known otherwise to even look at or examine these letters without having somebody done that. So if I have your attention, let's look at the suspect killer's beginnings. There's a lifetime of terror that follows him, and we're going to see how it wraps itself around the lifestyle of Jack W. Tarrance Jr. and many other crime sprees that Jack shares unbelievable proximity with. And in a lot of cases, we do have writing, but in many cases we do not. I think that we can literally only go off the numbers that the suspect himself is indicating he is responsible for. We do see he talks about hundreds in the Texas area having to do with the I-45 killings, the League City of Death killings. And then we also see the 1986 letter from the Zodiac where he indicates he killed 2 people up by Sacramento Freeway in 1986. And he says again, minus 100 plus. I see between those 200 murders. And that's give or take a few, obviously, based on the suspect's admittance itself. And then, of course, I believe there's somewhere around 260 murders inside this presentation that we're going to cover. So it should give us plenty to look at. Hopefully, these law enforcement agencies can come together on these cases, start comparing notes. I was just watching the Times Square killer in New York from 1979. This coincides with some of the murders in the I-45 and the League City murders, where they actually found not only the corpse of a victim in the grave, but they also found heads and hands to other individuals. So the full body wasn't found, just the heads and the hands. So I kind of perked up watching this documentary, finding out that the killer of these particular women were literally taking their head and hands. I'm sure that these law enforcement agencies were aware of these other happenings. I don't know if they would have known to connect them since they seemed so far away. You have to know that Jack was an avid traveler. He had no issue or problem getting on the road and driving across the United States on a whim, with or without the family. And a lot of times he was scouting out areas alone without the family before he would then move the family to that location. I also find that his typical killing circumference is within about 2 hours of where he lived approximately. So we'll talk about the relation to where he is versus where the killings occur at that particular time as well. So let's go. I've only got a few minutes, but let's see if we can cover this one. I believe this is a story of a lifetime killer designed and programmed by our own underground government, like a blueprint for technology. And this is in the words of the killer. This is a letter that was written purportedly by a fellow student of Sherry Jo Bates named Patricia Houts. I've not been able to find any information or any indication that there was even the existence of a Patricia Houts. However, this is a typed letter, which is consistent with the confession letter of Sherry Jo Bates. So I think that it is pertinent, again, because the suspect is complaining that the story is wrong and that they should get it right. So this is probably one of the first times we see this out of the suspect. And he says, wouldn't the story about the boy that killed her could be more rewarding? If people were to read of the life of a boy that turned killer, they might stop to think about the lives of their own children. Are we laying the blueprint for another killer? Might be one of the questions brought to mind by such a story. So he's looking to tell his story, obviously not at this point in time, but he's wanting people to understand he's doing something based on the way he was designed, not on his own choices. And we're going to keep that in mind as we go through some of these. We're going to even see a point in which he's going to attempt to tell the world that he wants to stop killing. Well, it looks like that's just about all I have for today, you guys. I'm going to learn to get my intros and outros down. So I'm happy to have shared what I could with you today. That means next week we're going to go ahead and jump right on into Jack's life, which will start in 1928 when he is born, and we will move clear on into 2006 when he passed. Everybody have a great day. Thanks so much. Oh,